My beloved child, something quietly revealing happened in a conversation your soulmate never expected to become important. It began with an ordinary question, almost too ordinary to remember. A third party was speaking with them casually, moving from one subject to another, when the conversation drifted toward the future. There was no dramatic announcement, no carefully prepared moment, just a question placed gently between two people: do you ever think about having children someday? And for a brief second, your soulmate became unusually still. Not uncomfortable. Not confused. Just thoughtful. Because the question did something unexpected. It carried their mind beyond the present and placed them inside a future they had rarely allowed themselves to describe aloud. Don't skip, because what mattered was not simply whether they said yes or no. What mattered was where their thoughts went before they answered. There are questions that can be answered immediately, and then there are questions that quietly reveal what the heart has already been building in private. This was the second kind. Your soulmate could have given a simple response. They could have laughed, changed the subject, or offered something vague about seeing what happens someday. Instead, they paused. And in that pause, something became visible. The third party noticed it too. There was a softness in your soulmate's expression that had not been there moments earlier, as though the question had opened a small hidden room inside them. Then they finally spoke. They said that if they ever created a family, they would want it to happen with someone who understood the meaning of staying. Someone who could make an ordinary home feel peaceful. Someone who could listen without turning every silence into a problem. Someone who would still choose tenderness after the excitement of something new had faded. And without realizing it, they were describing qualities they had already connected with you. Not because they were trying to impress anyone. Not because they had rehearsed those words. That is what made the moment so revealing. The answer seemed to arrive from somewhere deeper than preparation. Something important is waiting for you here, because the third party heard the answer differently than your soulmate intended. They leaned closer and asked, almost playfully, "You sound like you already have somebody in mind." Your soulmate smiled, but it was not the easy smile people use when they want to dismiss a question. It was quieter than that. Almost private. And instead of immediately denying it, they looked away. Just for a moment. Yet sometimes one moment carries more truth than an entire explanation. Perhaps you know that feeling yourself. Someone asks you about a future dream, and before you even decide what to say, one particular face appears in your mind. You did not invite it. You did not force it. It simply arrives. That was what seemed to happen to your soulmate. The conversation had begun with children, but somewhere between the question and the answer, it had become about you. Then came another question, and this one reached deeper. What kind of person would you want beside you when life gets complicated? Your soulmate did not mention appearance. They did not mention status, perfection, or some impossible picture of romance. They spoke about emotional safety. They said they wanted someone they could return to after a difficult day without feeling the need to perform. Someone whose presence could make silence feel comfortable rather than empty. Someone who could disagree without making love feel uncertain. Someone who could laugh with them over things nobody else would understand. And then, almost as though they had caught themselves saying too much, they stopped. Stay till the end, because the detail that followed was small enough to miss but meaningful enough to change the entire direction of the conversation. The third party asked, "Have you ever felt that with someone?" This time your soulmate did not answer immediately. Their hand moved toward their phone. Not dramatically. Almost unconsciously. Their fingers rested near it for a second, and then they pulled their hand back. Why would a question about family make someone think about their phone? Because sometimes the person occupying your thoughts is also the person whose name lives behind a screen you have checked more often than you would ever admit. Maybe there is a conversation there. Maybe an old message. Maybe a photograph. Maybe nothing more than a name that carries more emotional weight than anyone around them realizes. Whatever the reason, the third party noticed. And now curiosity entered the room. "There is someone," they said. Your soulmate gave a small laugh. "I didn't say that. You didn't have to." And suddenly, what had begun as casual conversation felt different. Not tense. Not uncomfortable. Just strangely honest. Your soulmate finally admitted that there was someone who had changed the way they imagined certain things. Notice the wording. They did not say someone had completed them. They did not place impossible responsibility on another person. They simply admitted that knowing this person had changed the shape of their future thoughts. There were things they once imagined abstractly: home, partnership, family, growing older beside somebody, and somehow those things had slowly acquired a face. Your face. But they still had not spoken your name. Not yet. Instead, they began remembering details. The way you respond when someone is being vulnerable. The small kindnesses you may not even realize people notice. The moments when you stayed calm instead of trying to prove something. The way you can carry your own depth without constantly demanding attention for it. Perhaps your soulmate has never told you how closely they noticed those things. That does not mean those moments disappeared. Some of the most meaningful impressions we leave on another person happen while we are convinced nothing important is occurring at all. A sentence said gently. A moment of patience. A look that communicates understanding. A simple act of remembering something another person mentioned days earlier. These things rarely announce themselves as important. Yet they remain. Your soulmate had been collecting those small impressions without realizing they were building toward a larger realization. And now a third party had accidentally opened the door. Something shifted when they were asked another question. So if this person came into your future for real, what would you want them to know? Your soulmate became quiet again. Longer this time. Imagine how unusual that question can feel when someone already occupies a meaningful place inside your heart. Because suddenly you are not discussing a hypothetical person anymore. You are thinking about words you might actually have to say one day. Your soulmate answered carefully. They said they would want that person to know that they were not searching for perfection. They would want honesty. Patience. Friendship beneath the romance. They wanted two people who could keep learning each other instead of assuming love should automatically make everything easy. They wanted a home where mistakes could be discussed without turning into distance. They wanted children, if life moved in that direction, to grow up seeing affection expressed through consistency rather than grand performances. And then your soulmate said something that made the third party stop asking questions for a few seconds. I think I already know who could understand that. There it was. Not a declaration. Not a dramatic confession. Just one quiet sentence carrying a surprising amount of meaning. The third party asked, "Then why aren't you telling them?" That question landed differently. Because imagining a future can feel safe when it remains inside the mind. Saying it aloud to the person involved requires vulnerability. Your soulmate looked down. Perhaps they have been wondering the same thing. Perhaps timing has felt complicated. Perhaps they have been trying to understand whether what they feel is temporary or something with deeper roots. Perhaps they fear saying too much too soon and changing something they value. These are ordinary human hesitations, yet they can make powerful feelings remain unspoken longer than anyone expects. Don't skip, because the most revealing part was not what your soulmate said next. It was what they refused to say. The third party tried to guess who this person might be. They mentioned possibilities. Your soulmate rejected them gently. Another name came up. Again, no. Then the third party laughed and said, "Whoever this is, they clearly matter." Your soulmate could have ended the conversation. Instead, they answered, "They do." 2 words. Quietly spoken. No embellishment. And somewhere inside those 2 words lived all the memories they had not explained. The conversations they replayed later. The times your absence felt more noticeable than expected. The moments when something happened and they instinctively wanted to tell you. The subtle comparison that occurred whenever someone else entered their world and somehow failed to create the same ease. That is often how a person recognizes emotional significance, not through constant intensity, but through recurrence. One person keeps returning to the mind during unrelated moments. A song. A familiar place. A joke they would understand. A question about the future. And suddenly the mind knows where to go. The third party, still curious, asked one final thing: when you picture yourself years from now, what is the first thing you see? Your soulmate did not answer with a grand house or some perfectly arranged life. They described a morning. That was all. A simple morning. Light entering a room. A little noise somewhere nearby. 2 people tired but content, moving around each other with the familiarity that only comes from sharing real life. Coffee becoming cold because someone got distracted. A small disagreement about something unimportant. Laughter returning 5 minutes later. Nothing cinematic. Nothing impossible. Just belonging. And then your soulmate smiled to themselves and added, "I know who I can imagine there." The third party did not need another explanation. Neither did your soulmate. Because by then, the original question had already answered something much larger. They had been asked about having children, but underneath that question was another one: who feels safe enough to imagine beside you when the future becomes real? Their heart had answered before their caution could interfere. It led toward you. Yet this is where the story becomes even more interesting, because after that conversation ended, your soulmate did something they had not planned to do. They picked up their phone again. This time they did not immediately put it down. They opened something connected to you and stayed there longer than necessary. Perhaps it was your name. Perhaps a message. Perhaps a photograph or a conversation they had read before. Whatever it was, something about those words they had just spoken now felt different when they were alone. Until that day, they may have been able to treat certain thoughts about you as separate pieces. Missing you was one thing, caring about you another, imagining you in their future another. But the third party's innocent question had quietly connected those pieces. Your soulmate was beginning to understand that their feelings were not only about wanting another conversation with you. They were not only about nostalgia, attraction, or curiosity. They were beginning to ask themselves a much more meaningful question: why, whenever someone asks me what I want years from now, does my mind keep returning to the same person? And the answer forming inside them was not loud. It was almost peaceful. Because maybe some realizations do not arrive like lightning. Maybe they arrive like recognition. Like seeing something that has quietly been in the room the entire time. Something important is waiting for you, because while your soulmate was looking at that screen, they remembered one specific moment involving you, something small you probably never considered significant. And that memory became the reason they nearly reached out. Their finger moved toward the message box. They stopped. They read something again. Then they started typing. What they wrote was not a confession, at least not yet. It was only a few words. But those words were connected directly to the question the third party had asked earlier, and if they ever decide to send them, you may finally understand just how far into their future their thoughts about you have already traveled. Because the conversation about children did not create their feelings. It simply revealed where those feelings had been quietly pointing all along. And what happened after they began typing is where the real meaning of that answer starts to unfold. The words remained unsent, but they had already changed something inside your soulmate. For several quiet seconds, they stared at the message box as though it had become a doorway between what they had been feeling privately and what they might finally allow you to see. They had typed something simple, nothing dramatic, nothing designed to overwhelm you, just a sentence that began with, "I was asked something today, and for some reason it made me think of you." Then they stopped. Read it once. Read it again. And suddenly that harmless sentence felt far more revealing than they intended. Because how could they explain what had really happened without admitting everything that came before it? How could they tell you that a question about children had somehow led to thoughts of shared mornings, ordinary laughter, patience, home, and the kind of partnership that survives beyond exciting beginnings? Don't skip, because this is where your soulmate began realizing that the strongest part of their answer had nothing to do with children at all. It was about who they trusted inside the picture. Anyone can imagine a beautiful future when everything is perfect. But your soulmate had not imagined perfection. They had imagined real life. Busy days. Quiet evenings. Misunderstandings resolved with care. Responsibilities shared instead of carried alone. Small celebrations nobody else would understand. And somewhere inside every imperfect detail, you kept appearing naturally. That surprised them. It was one thing to care about you in the present. It was another to discover that their mind had quietly given you a place in scenes that had not even happened yet. So they erased the message. Not because the thought was untrue, but because it felt too true to send casually. Then they placed the phone beside them and tried returning to something ordinary. A task. A conversation. A distraction. Anything that would pull them away from what had just surfaced. But some realizations become louder when you stop trying to understand them. And this one followed your soulmate into the rest of their day. They remembered the third party asking, "You sound like you already know what kind of person you want beside you." At the time, your soulmate had smiled. Now, alone, they understood why. They had not been describing an imaginary partner. They had been describing emotional qualities they had already experienced with someone. With you. Stay till the end, because the next memory that returned was the one that almost made them reopen the message immediately. It was not necessarily some grand romantic moment. In fact, its simplicity was exactly why it mattered. They remembered a time when they had shown you a version of themselves that was less polished than usual. Maybe they were uncertain about something. Maybe tired. Maybe unusually quiet. Maybe they did not know how to explain what they were feeling. And instead of forcing an answer from them, you gave them room. You did not make the moment about yourself. You did not demand that they become cheerful so you could feel comfortable. You simply stayed emotionally present. Your soulmate may not have told you how deeply that registered. At the time, they might have treated it like a small kindness. But now, after being asked about family and the future, that memory had taken on a different meaning. Because when people imagine building a life with someone, they rarely remember only the impressive moments. They remember how that person made difficult moments feel. They remember whether silence felt safe. They remember whether vulnerability was respected. They remember whether they could be ordinary without becoming less lovable. And somehow, your soulmate had begun associating those things with you. That was why the third party's question had unsettled them in such a gentle way. It had given language to something they had been experiencing without naming. Then something unexpected happened. The third party contacted them again. Nothing serious. Just a continuation of the earlier conversation. They teased your soulmate lightly, saying, "I still think you had somebody specific in mind." Your soulmate tried to brush it aside, but the third party continued, "You changed when you answered. You were talking about a person, not an idea." That sentence stayed with them. A person, not an idea. Your soulmate read it twice. Because maybe that was exactly the distinction they had been avoiding. It is easy to speak vaguely about someday. Someday I might settle down. Someday I might build a family. Someday I might meet someone who understands me. Someday I might finally feel ready. But what happens when someday suddenly has someone's eyes? Someone's voice? Someone's way of laughing? Someone's name? The future becomes harder to dismiss when it starts feeling familiar. Your soulmate sent back a short response, "Maybe you noticed more than I thought." And the third party answered with another question. "Does this person know?" Your soulmate did not reply immediately. That question carried more weight than the first one. "Do you know? Do you know how often you have appeared in their thoughts lately? Do you know they remember things you probably forgot saying? Do you know that when someone asked them what kind of future they wanted, their mind did not search through endless possibilities? It moved toward something familiar. Do you know how many times they have almost said more, then chosen restraint because they were still trying to understand themselves? Your soulmate finally replied, "Probably not." And that answer brought a strange softness with it. Not sadness. Not regret. More like awareness. Because once they admitted that you probably did not know, another question became unavoidable: how long did they want you to remain unaware? Something important is waiting for you here. Your soulmate was not suddenly preparing some enormous declaration. Their thoughts were actually becoming more grounded than that. They began thinking about honesty in smaller steps. A real conversation instead of a perfect speech. A genuine question instead of a rehearsed confession. Maybe telling you that you crossed their mind. Maybe asking how you imagine your own future. Maybe allowing the subject to unfold naturally instead of trying to control where it leads. There was maturity in that realization. They understood that caring deeply about someone does not mean deciding the entire future alone. A meaningful future is created by two people who gradually discover whether their hopes can stand beside each other. And your soulmate began wondering about your hopes. Not the version they had imagined for you. Yours. Did you want the same kind of home? Did you value the same kind of emotional closeness? Did you imagine children someday, or perhaps a completely different future? What made you feel secure inside a relationship? What kind of life would make you wake up years from now and feel grateful for the person beside you? These questions made your soulmate's thoughts about you deeper, because now they were not simply imagining you fitting into their future. They were beginning to care about whether they could fit gently and respectfully into yours. That distinction mattered. It changed the feeling from fantasy into consideration. And perhaps that was the rare realization the third party's question had unlocked. Wanting a future with somebody is not only about hoping they choose you. It is about wanting to understand what choosing you would mean for them too. Your soulmate picked up their phone again. This time, instead of returning to the unfinished message, they opened an older conversation between you. They scrolled slowly, not searching for anything specific at first. A joke appeared. They smiled. A small misunderstanding appeared. They remembered how it felt. Then a message from you caught their attention. Something you had said about relationships, trust, family, or what truly matters when two people try to build something lasting. Maybe you said it casually. Maybe it came during an unrelated conversation. But your soulmate paused there because those old words suddenly connected with everything they had been thinking today. They realized you had already shown them pieces of your values. Perhaps you once said you wanted peace more than appearances. Perhaps you spoke about loyalty as something demonstrated in ordinary choices. Perhaps you mentioned wanting a relationship where two people could grow without losing themselves. Whatever the exact words, your soulmate noticed something. Your vision had never sounded impossible. It sounded human. And strangely, it resembled the answer they had just given the third party. That resemblance made them lean back and stare at the screen. Because now they were wondering whether these thoughts about you had been growing longer than they realized. Maybe that earlier conversation had planted something. Maybe hearing your values had made them subconsciously imagine what life might feel like if two people with similar hopes actually chose one another. They had never stopped to connect those moments. Until now. Don't skip, because the third party then asked a question your soulmate could no longer answer vaguely. If they called you right now and asked what you really want with them, what would you say? Your soulmate read the question and felt their thoughts slow down. What would they say? Not what would sound impressive. Not what would protect them from vulnerability. What would they honestly say? They began forming the answer silently. I would say I want to know where this could go. I would say I do not want to rush something meaningful, but I also do not want to pretend it means nothing. I would say I think about you more seriously than I expected. I would say that when I imagine the future, you appear there in ways I did not deliberately put you there. I would say that something about you feels compatible with the kind of life I want to build. And perhaps most importantly, I would ask what you want too. Your soulmate did not send all of that to the third party. They simply wrote, I think I would finally be honest. 4 words that quietly marked a change. Finally be honest. Notice what that means. There had been something to be honest about for longer than they had admitted. The conversation had not created a new feeling. It had exposed an old one. Something that had been gathering beneath ordinary interactions, missed opportunities, small moments of closeness, periods of distance, and all the thoughts they kept putting away until a random question made everything connect. Later that evening, your soulmate found themselves imagining that simple morning again. But this time the image changed slightly. It was not only about laughter and quiet routines. They imagined conversation too. 2 people sitting together after a long day, talking about decisions that mattered. Supporting each other's goals. Learning when to speak and when to listen. Raising children together if that became part of their shared path, but never allowing parenthood to erase the friendship underneath the partnership. They imagined being able to look across a room years later and still recognize the person they chose, not because everything remained easy, but because both people kept choosing curiosity about each other instead of becoming strangers. And there you were again. Quietly present. Your soulmate almost laughed at themselves. They had been asked one question, and it had turned into an entire evening of reflection. Yet beneath all those thoughts was something surprisingly peaceful. They were not trying to predict exactly what would happen between you. They were simply accepting that you mattered enough to be part of the question. That alone was new honesty. Then their phone lit up. For one instant, they thought it might be you. The reaction came faster than thought, that tiny shift in attention, that instinctive hope, that sudden curiosity. It was not you. But the reaction itself told them something. And they smiled because they knew it. The third party's words returned once more, does this person know? Maybe soon, your soulmate thought. Maybe they should. So they reopened the message they had erased earlier. This time they started again differently. They did not mention children. Not yet. They did not mention the future. They wrote something smaller, safer, but more personal. Something happened today that made me remember a conversation we had. They stared at it. Then another sentence followed. It made me realize I never asked what you really want your future to look like. Your soulmate paused there. That was the question. Not a declaration. Not pressure. An opening. A way of allowing 2 futures to speak to each other instead of silently assuming they belong together. Their finger hovered near send. Once again, hesitation arrived. But this time it was different. Earlier, hesitation came from wanting to hide what the question had revealed. Now it came from understanding that once they opened this conversation with you, they might hear something meaningful in return. Perhaps something that surprised them. Perhaps something that confirmed a feeling neither of you had clearly named. Perhaps simply a truth that helped both of you understand one another better. Stay till the end, because just as your soulmate was deciding whether to send those words, they noticed something inside your old conversation that they had somehow overlooked before. A sentence from you. One sentence. It had been sitting there for much longer than today, but suddenly it seemed connected to everything the third party had asked. Your soulmate read it slowly, then again, and the meaning landed differently now. Because without knowing it, you may have already answered part of the question they had been afraid to ask. And what your soulmate realized from that forgotten sentence is what finally pushed their hand closer to the send button. That forgotten sentence suddenly felt as though it had been waiting for this exact moment. Your soulmate had passed over it before without understanding why it mattered, but now, after everything the third party had asked, the words seemed completely different. You had written something simple about the future, something about not needing a perfect life, only wanting the right person to build an honest one with. At the time, your soulmate had read it as part of an ordinary conversation. Tonight, they read it as a glimpse into you. They sat there quietly, the phone warm in their hand, realizing that while they had spent hours wondering whether their hopes could ever align with yours, you had already revealed something important without even trying. You were not describing some flawless relationship. You were describing partnership. Two people learning. Two people adjusting. Two people creating something meaningful through everyday choices. And that was almost exactly what your soulmate had described when the third party asked about children. Don't skip, because this was the moment the coincidence stopped feeling like coincidence to them and started feeling like compatibility worth exploring. Not proof of some guaranteed future. Not a promise that everything would automatically work. Something more grounded than that. A reason to have the conversation. Your soulmate slowly returned to the message they had been writing. Something happened today that made me remember a conversation we had. It made me realize I never asked what you really want your future to look like. They read those words again. They seemed gentle enough. Honest enough. But something was missing. Your soulmate knew it. If they sent only that, you might never understand why the question mattered. So they added another line. Someone asked me something about my own future, and your name was the first thing that came to mind. Then they froze. There it was. The sentence they had been circling around all day. Your name was the first thing that came to mind. No elaborate confession could have felt more revealing. Because it was not trying to convince you of anything. It was simply describing what happened. A question was asked. Their mind moved toward you. Your soulmate nearly erased it. Their thumb hovered over the screen, and for a few seconds the old instinct returned, the instinct to soften everything until nothing vulnerable remained. But then they remembered the third party asking, if they called you right now and asked what you really want, what would you say? They remembered their own answer, I think I would finally be honest. Something important is waiting for you here, because honesty did not suddenly make your soulmate fearless. It simply gave them a reason not to hide behind vagueness anymore. There is a quiet difference between protecting something meaningful and avoiding it entirely. Your soulmate was beginning to understand that difference. If they truly respected what they felt for you, eventually they would have to give you enough truth to respond to. Otherwise, they would remain inside a future that existed only in their imagination, never discovering what you actually wanted. And that thought changed the balance. The possibility of hearing your real answer began to matter more than the comfort of staying silent. But they still did not press send. Instead, they stood up and walked away from the phone. Sometimes a person needs physical distance from a decision before they can hear themselves clearly. Your soulmate moved through the room, doing small ordinary things while one question followed them: why did I think of you? They did not accept the easiest answer. They went deeper. Was it because they missed you? Partly. Was it because there was attraction? Perhaps. Was it because you shared meaningful memories? Certainly. But none of those explanations fully captured why a question about raising children had brought you into focus so instantly. The real answer had to do with character. Your soulmate had not imagined you because you made the future look exciting. They imagined you because something about you made the future feel manageable. That distinction surprised them. Excitement can make someone imagine a weekend. Trust makes someone imagine years. And when the third party asked about family, responsibility, patience, and the person they would want beside them through all of it, your soulmate's mind had reached for someone who had already made them feel understood in ordinary moments. You stay till the end, because the next realization was even quieter, and perhaps more important. Your soulmate began thinking about how they would want you to feel in that future too. Until now, much of their reflection had centered on what you represented to them: peace, familiarity, emotional safety, possibility. But suddenly they wondered what they represented to you. Could they offer the same steadiness they hoped to receive? Could they listen when you were overwhelmed without immediately trying to solve everything? Could they make space for your dreams without feeling threatened by them? Could they become someone you would trust with the unpolished parts of your life? Those questions humbled them. Love, they realized, was not only about recognizing the right qualities in another person. It was also about deciding which qualities you were willing to develop within yourself. And in that moment, the conversation about children became something far more meaningful than a romantic fantasy. It became a mirror. Your soulmate found themselves asking what kind of partner they wanted to become before asking what kind of partner they wanted to have. Maybe that is why they had hesitated for so long. Somewhere underneath everything, they knew that thinking seriously about you required them to think seriously about themselves. They could not simply say, "You fit into the life I want," without also wondering, could I become someone who fits gently into the life you want? That question followed them back to the phone. The message was still there. Nothing had disappeared. Your soulmate sat down, reread it, then added one more sentence. "I don't know where that conversation would lead, but I'd like to know how you see things." There was no pressure in it. No assumption. Just an invitation to be known. And strangely, that made the message feel more intimate than a dramatic declaration ever could. Because your soulmate was not trying to claim a future with you. They were opening the possibility of discussing one. That is where meaningful things often begin, not with certainty, but with two people becoming brave enough to exchange honest questions. Their finger moved toward send. Then the phone buzzed. The third party had messaged again. Your soulmate almost laughed at the timing. The message read, "Did you tell them?" Your soulmate stared at it and smiled. "Not yet," they replied. The response came quickly, "Why?" Your soulmate considered writing something complicated, but instead they typed, "Because this matters more than I expected." That answer surprised even them. This matters. Not this is exciting. Not this is confusing. This matters. There was gravity in those words, but not heaviness. They carried care. Your soulmate was beginning to recognize that you were not someone they wanted to approach carelessly. Whatever existed between you deserved more than impulsive words sent during an emotional evening. So instead of rushing, they decided to think about what they truly wanted you to understand. And that is where something beautiful happened. Their thoughts stopped racing ahead to years from now. They came back to the beginning. To you and them as two people. Not parents in some imagined future. Not a perfect couple inside a beautiful picture. Just two people who might still have things left to discover about each other. They realized that perhaps the first conversation did not need to be about children at all. It could begin with something smaller. Where are you in your life right now? What are you hoping for? What has changed inside you lately? What do you need from someone who wants to stay close to you? Those questions felt real. And your soulmate understood that if a larger future ever grew between you, it would probably be built through conversations exactly like those. One honest exchange at a time. One misunderstood thing clarified instead of buried. One vulnerable moment handled with patience instead of judgment. One choice after another until trust became something you could both stand on. Don't skip, because as your soulmate imagined that conversation, they suddenly remembered another detail from the third party's original question. The third party had not merely asked, "Do you want children?" They had followed it with, "Who would you trust to raise them with you?" Your soulmate had almost forgotten that second part. Now it returned with surprising force. Trust. That was the word underneath everything. Not chemistry. Not timing. Not appearances. Trust. Who would they trust with the decisions that mattered? Who would they trust to see them uncertain? Who would they trust to disagree with them and still remain respectful? Who would they trust to celebrate their growth rather than compete with it? Who would they trust around the people they loved most? Again, their thoughts moved toward you. And now your soulmate understood why. You had given them evidence in small ways. Perhaps you once kept something personal they shared private. Perhaps you defended their dignity even when you were frustrated. Perhaps you gave them an honest answer when a prettier answer would have been easier. Perhaps you remembered a boundary they had mentioned and respected it without needing to be reminded. Those things may have seemed small at the time, but trust is rarely built through one spectacular gesture. It grows through repeated evidence that another person can hold your reality carefully. Your soulmate began remembering those pieces one by one. And with each memory, the question became less mysterious. Of course their mind had gone to you. Not because the future was already decided, but because when asked whom they could imagine trusting inside something meaningful, your name had history behind it. Something important is waiting for you, because this was the first moment your soulmate wondered whether you might have noticed the same pattern in them. Had there been moments when their name came to your mind unexpectedly? Had you ever heard someone describe the kind of person they wanted and quietly thought of them? Had you ever imagined saying something, then decided the timing was not right? Your soulmate could not know. And for perhaps the first time, they accepted that wondering was no longer enough. If they wanted the truth, they would eventually need to give you a chance to speak it. They opened your conversation again. The unfinished message was waiting. This time, instead of hovering over send, your soulmate read it aloud quietly to themselves. Hearing the words changed them. Something happened today that made me remember a conversation we had. It made me realize I never asked what you really want your future to look like. Someone asked me something about my own future, and your name was the first thing that came to mind. I don't know where that conversation would lead, but I'd like to know how you see things. Simple. Vulnerable. Respectful. They could imagine you reading it. They could imagine the pause afterward. The message disappeared from the typing box. Sent. For a second, your soulmate simply stared. There was no dramatic transformation in the room. Nothing outside them changed. But internally, something had shifted. The secret was no longer completely theirs. They had placed one small piece of it between you. Enough to invite you closer. Not enough to overwhelm you. And perhaps that was exactly right. The third party had asked a question about children, but somehow it had led your soulmate toward a more immediate act of courage, asking you how you imagined your own future. Now came the part they could not rehearse. Waiting. Your soulmate put the phone down, picked it up again, then smiled at themselves and put it down once more. Every sound suddenly seemed louder. Every notification made their attention move. They reminded themselves not to attach meaning to how quickly you answered. You could be busy. You could need time to understand the message. You might read it more than once, just as they had rewritten it more than once. The important thing was that the door was open now. Then, after some time, the screen lit up. Your name appeared. Your soulmate's expression changed instantly. Not because they already knew what you had said they had not opened it yet, but because suddenly the conversation they had spent all day imagining had become real. They waited a few seconds before touching the notification, almost as though they wanted to preserve that final moment of not knowing. Then they opened your message. Your reply was not long. But the first sentence made your soulmate sit completely still. You had not avoided the question. You had not laughed it away. Instead, you wrote something that revealed you had been thinking about your own future more deeply than they realized. And then came the sentence that brought the third party's question back all over again. You described the kind of person you hoped would be beside you one day. Patient. Honest. Emotionally present. Someone who could make ordinary life feel meaningful. Someone who would choose communication instead of guessing. Your soulmate read those words and felt a quiet disbelief. The similarities were impossible for them to ignore. You were describing many of the same qualities they had described earlier. Then your message continued. And if I ever build a family, I'd want it to start with a relationship that still feels like friendship when life gets complicated. Your soulmate stopped there. Friendship when life gets complicated. Those words stayed with them because they touched something they had not managed to say earlier. They had imagined children, a home, mornings, responsibilities, but beneath every image had been one foundational hope, that the person beside them would still feel like someone they genuinely liked, respected, and wanted to talk to. And now you had said it too. Your soulmate looked toward the ceiling and gave a quiet laugh, almost amazed by how a random conversation earlier in the day had led here. Yet your message was not finished. There was one final line. A line your soulmate did not expect. A line that made them go back and reread everything from the beginning. You had written, "It's strange you asked me this today, because recently someone has been making me imagine those things differently too." Your soulmate's heart did not need to race for the moment to matter. They simply became very still. Someone. You had not named them. You had not made any promise. But suddenly the mystery had reversed. All day, the third party had been trying to discover who your soulmate was thinking about. Now your soulmate found themselves asking the same question about you. Who had been making you imagine the future differently? They read the line again, and one possibility quietly rose above the others. Could it be me? Your soulmate began typing a response, then stopped. They could ask directly. They could pretend not to notice. They could choose something playful. But after everything that had happened, hiding behind vague words no longer felt right. So they wrote one question. Only one. Can I ask who? Their finger hovered for barely a second this time. Send. And what you answered next would finally reveal whether the path that had led their thoughts straight to you had been quietly leading your thoughts back toward them as well.